So the last part then, when we talk about the feminization of teaching, is to help you tie it into the Freedom Writers assignment, the media analysis of that movie. There are a lot of different implications between the feminization of teaching and the deconstruction of that narrative in the film. And in addition to Chapter 3 of Tozer, I would also recommend considering Chapter 4 on African American educational history, as well as the Du Bois article. The reason why is because there are kind of two interdependent parts of the narrative that need deconstructing. The first part is this idea of a teacher as emotional caregiver rather than intellectual, and also as a worker that doesn't really have the right to advocate for oneself. The other part is a devaluing of the intellectual capability in communities of color. This idea that communities of color are not self-governing or self-determining, and the idea that communities of color do not value education. Now, if we understand that these two stereotypes are interdependent, it makes an analysis of the movie much stronger and a lot more clear, in my opinion. So here's the reason why. If we go right to the movie Freedom Writers, one of the things we can see is that we're really valorizing the care and the hard work of the teacher. We don't necessarily talk about her as an intellectual worker. We talk about her as an emotional worker. And that's important because what we're doing is we're making her gender, part of what makes her effective at her job. But what we're also saying is she doesn't really deserve a lot of money or a lot of resources, because how hard do you have to work to care? What skills are required to care? Is that a marketable thing? In that sense, we can see that it's a devalued behavior, even as it's valorized in a particular context. So the other part of that is when she's martyring herself in this way, which she really is in the movie. She makes so little money that she has to work 2 extra jobs. She's constantly struggling. She has no personal life whatsoever. And in fact, she is so selfless, without self, that she basically loses her husband, her marriage. She basically puts everything personal to the side in order to dedicate herself to teaching. So the question then, when we talk about teachers as workers, is should we really expect that from a teacher? Is that fair? And how does the assumption of women as teachers tie into this belief that somehow that's appropriate to ask a worker to literally have no life at all outside of their job? There's really very few other professions where that expectation is there, and quite often those professions are also feminized professions, such as nursing, for example. Whereas with police officers, that's also a service profession, something that's very valued in the public eye, but there's not necessarily the expectation that police would never get a vacation or would accept no money or these other conditions that we kind of expect teachers to put up with. So gender is part of it, it's not the whole thing. But for the purpose of the media assignment, I want us to just consider that idea, the idea that the feminization of teaching and this idea of emotion and of sacrifice and not having any right to protect or advocate for your labor, that's all very bundled together. The other part of that is this valorization of a white female teacher in particular as a savior figure or an individual hero, as someone who has to reach down and lift up communities of color because they cannot save themselves without her. Now, obviously that's very problematic for a lot of reasons, but from a very basic perspective, it's not historically accurate. That's where Chapter 4 from Tozer and the Du Bois article come into play. Historically, the reality has been that African American adults, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, communities of color in general, have demonstrated very clear dedication to the well-being of their children and to educational excellence for their children. That may not look the way the school system has wanted it to look, but there's a difference between valuing a system of schooling and valuing a strong education for your child. So, at a very basic level, this idea of needing a white teacher savior in order to create academic excellence in youth of color is just not historically real. The other part, though, is that it indicates a codependent relationship. We have to see those youth as unable to save themselves if we want to see this teacher as a savior. If the community is able to save itself, there's really no reason for her to be a martyr. So those two identities are very much interdependent. Um, and in both cases, they create a logic where it's values and behaviors that are the key to reforming public schools, that are the key to more equitable outcomes for students of color in particular. Now, as we move forward in the class, one of the things we're going to see is that it's actually finance that plays a huge role. And it's actually access to high quality teachers and self-determination on the part of adults in the community. These are the factors that will create strong, equitable outcomes for youth of color. And there's proven evidence to support that idea. When we focus on values, when we focus on individual behaviors, we ignore the institutional equality and we blame the victim and say, why can't you fit yourself better into this institution? We're not looking at the institution and saying, how are you designed to marginalize this population of people? So keep that in mind when you're watching the movie, when you're reading Tozer, chapter 4, when you're reading Du Bois, and as we move forward. But in general, if there's an explanation that looks at the family, looks at the student as an individual, or looks at values and behaviors, you can be very sure that that explanation is hiding or rationalizing inequality. If there is no context to it, if there is no systemic analysis, then what you're doing is you're creating a naturalizing effect on the inequality that's there. So hopefully that helps a little bit to tie this together with the Freedom Writers exercise. But hopefully the other thing that'll help is the nice white lady clip that's tied to it. It's kind of funny, but hopefully it'll bring to light a little more of what I've been talking about. But as you move forward with the assignment, just let me know if you have any questions or concerns. If you want to run a draft by me before you turn it in, that's also completely okay. So good luck, and I look forward to reading your analysis.